Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Light to the World, the Bible month that focusing on Book of Isaiah. I'm going to hear diverse voices when reading Book of Isaiah. And I'm Jasmine Devadasan, Learning Network Officer in the Northwest and Man region. So I'll be just introducing the theme. Followed by different speakers bringing their own perspectives into reading Book of Isaiah. Before we start, shall I say a prayer? Let us pray. Creator of the world, eternal God, we have come from many places for a little while. Redeemer of humanity, God with us. We have come with all our differences, seeking common ground. Spirit of unity, go between God. We have come on journeys of our own, to a place where journeys meet. So here in this place, let us take time together. For when paths cross and pilgrims gather, there is much to share and celebrate. In your name, three in one God, pattern of community. Amen. So Isaiah from diverse voices. Why we need to hear different voices in reading biblical text? There are few reasons why we need to hear different voices. Our context demands us to hear different voices in reading biblical narratives. As a reader and interpreters of the Bible, we need to be aware of certain realities. Firstly, we need to recognize that Western interpretation of the Bible is not a normative for all Christians everywhere. Christianity is growing at such a rate in other parts of the world that soon the majority of Christians worldwide will not be white or Western. Secondly, not only our context is becoming multicultural in nature, therefore being aware of cultural appropriateness is important in our interpretations and communicating of the gospel message. Therefore, it is important to ask the question, how might our preaching and leading worship move towards to engage these new realities? Thirdly, worldwide demographic changes demand that other ethnic perspectives, both abroad and at home, be given an attentive hearing. So the theological biblical work of this growing global presence cannot be ignored. And fourthly, no one reads or interprets the Bible unbiased. The question is about how our cultural and historical context influences our reading of scriptures has a practical and pastoral implications. It is our cultural blind spots keeps us from reading the Bible correctly. Then they can also keep us from applying Bible correctly. So we need to be aware of our own cultural assumptions, which affect the way in which we read the Bible. So when we are prepared to hear what our non-Western sisters and brothers have to teach us about Christian faith and practices. So as a reader, we need to be aware of all those realities. But when it comes to biblical narratives, we need to acknowledge that the biblical narratives are constructed and it falls within the limits of people who constructed it. So therefore, it is important to ask the question of whose story is about and who is telling the story. That will determine our starting point of reading the text and will decide who should be included or who should not be included in the text. So the challenge would be, how do we start retelling the story of ancient Israel? For some people, Exodus event might be the starting point. And for some, the monarchy is a starting point instead of starting with the Genesis. And you can very well aware of the 4 gospel writers. They start with the different stories for their own audience. So when we start to retell the story of Israelites or the biblical narratives, it is important to see why a particular nation dominates and is in control, which will help us to understand how the certain biblical story deals with the concept of nationalism, for example. Within that reading, how we position ourselves within the story. The story that privileges some people and leave out others. Therefore, different perspectives in reading the biblical text would help us to bring or recenter people who are marginalized, or bring back into focus another sets of characters as we tell the biblical stories for our context. Different starting point, different focus, different way of retelling the biblical story. So today evening, this experience not only will challenge us, but also look biblical text differently and work towards more appropriate way of applying to our own context. And we have 3 different perspectives that we are going to hear. And firstly, I would like to invite Dr. Kirsi Cobb to bring her own perspective into reading biblical text. Dr. Kirsi Cobb is lecturer in biblical studies in Cliff College. Originally from Finland, Kirsi moved to the UK in 1999 to pursue her PA in theology, but later on she completed her PhD at the University of Wales. And so her PhD is focused on biblical figure of Miriam and the multiple ways her story can be read when using different methods of hermeneutics. So Kirsi's main research interests are women's studies and biblical interpretation. So as your expertise is on biblical interpretation, and you will bring great insight to this evening. And Kirsi is going to speak from the perspective of women and girls. Kirsi, I hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jasmine, for the very kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen because as a good lecturer, I cannot talk about anything without having some form of a visual aid. So I shall just do that and begin. So looking at this idea of reading biblical text from the point of view of women and girls, the Bible passage that I kind of started off with is that in Isaiah, and in Isaiah 42, the idea of the light of the world comes from one of the servant songs. So this is Isaiah 42 and verse 6. It says here, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness, the servants. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and light for the Gentiles. And what is interesting about this idea is that Isaiah seems to be using the idea of light basically as some sort of a symbol for salvation. Something good is about to happen. So whenever I'm teaching on Isaiah, I kind of say to my class, okay, complete the following sentence. People who walk in darkness will see a great light. And so we get this idea that something good is about to happen. So Jasmine then asked me to ponder on this idea of a light coming to the Mount Zion. If all the people are going to come to Mount Zion like Isaiah kind of prophesizes, then how is that going to affect issues to do with women and girls? What is it that we would need to take into account? And in this particular story, the story starts right from the beginning. So we need to go back to Genesis, and I won't spend that much time on this. But I believe that all of us have heard the beautiful passages in Genesis 1:27, which says, so God created mankind, or humankind, sorry, NIV, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So here, when it comes to the Genesis story, we hear this idea of God creating male and female, man and woman in his own image. He gives them the exact same job to rule over the earth, to care for the earth, be fruitful and multiply. But of course, things don't stay as the perfect world, and things do go wrong eventually. So we get to this story then in Genesis 3, where we have the so-called story of the fall, and one of its consequences is in Genesis 3:16. And this is just a little Old Testament humor. I always find it quite funny that Genesis 3:16 is this verse, and then John 3:16, of course, says something completely different, but that's just me. Right, Genesis 3:16, God says there, to the woman he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And it is really from here that when it comes to women and girls, the oppression has its beginnings. What's interesting about the Hebrew here is the fact that this verb form, he will rule over you, is what in the Hebrew we would call an imperfect tense, which is really talking about how the things here will be, not that this is a desired state, not that this is how it should always be, but that this is actually something that will happen in the future. And of course, the rest of the Bible and our own world is a proof of the fact that things have gone down the line, that when it comes to the world, men usually hold power over women. Now, for that we have a nice posh word called patriarchy. And when it comes to patriarchy, it really originally just meant the rule of the father, like in a Roman household where the father would be the big boss and everybody else would kind of come under him. But nowadays, when scholars use this word, they usually use it to refer to the fact that generally speaking, men have an advantage over women in this world and have the power. Now, that doesn't mean that no woman has any power. I am very aware that as a white female biblical studies lecturer, I'm extremely privileged over lots of other men and women. So it doesn't mean that, but it means that just generally speaking, we are talking about men having power over women. And there is a biblical scholar called Karl Myers who actually suggested that maybe we should call it, instead of patriarchy, we should give this name a heterarchy, which literally then would then translate to the fact that different people hold power at different times. This hasn't taken off that much, but so a lot of scholars, including myself, still use a patriarchy for this. Now, the thing is that when you are living in a system where you don't have necessarily as much power as others do, and in this case, women don't necessarily have as much power as men do, then the damage that can cause is often referred to as trauma. And when it comes to trauma, there are really, there are different kinds of trauma, but the two kinds that I'm referring to here is, first of all, the kind of trauma that, this is from Kathy Caruth, a trauma theorician, says that a trauma is an overwhelming experience of sudden or catastrophic events in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed, uncontrolled, repetitive appearance of hallucinations and other intrusive phenomena. So to translate a very complicated sentence, it is basically this. Trauma is something that occurs to you when whatever the crisis that you are facing goes beyond your body's ability to cope. So this is not a decision that you make, this is a decision your body makes for you. So if you have heard Bevan, who is again a very known trauma theorician, he has written this really well-known book called The Body Keeps the Score, and that really summarizes it. The trauma is kept in your body. It refuses to be verbalized. It might come back to you as a flashback, as a nightmare. It might be stored away for years and then all of a sudden turn up. And that is something that we'll call a trauma. And there are different things that can cause trauma. So for example, rape could be something that could cause trauma. Natural disasters can cause trauma, severe illness or injury, the death of a loved one, witnessing an act of violence. So you can get so-called secondary trauma from witnessing something having been done to another person. And this is something, because I do trauma theology, I could speak till the cows come home today. But what I just want to emphasize here, that if trauma happens to you, it is really our response to it that makes it into a trauma, and that response is not a decision you make. So two people could experience a natural disaster, the same event, and one might be traumatized and one is not. The reasons for those are really complex, but I just want to emphasize that it is not to do with your strength of will or character or whatever. It is a decision your body makes for you. But then there is another type of trauma called insidious trauma, and this is very pertinent when it comes to patriarchy. because this is insidious trauma is a term that was put together by a lady called Maria Root. And she basically refers to insidious trauma when there is oppression that is part of the culture and the society that you live in, such as patriarchy. So in this kind of culture, oppression is then usually directed towards someone who is different to whatever those in power would like to see. So it can be, for example, gender, it can be color, it can be sexual orientation, it can be physical ability. And this is often systematic and so much part of the system and the culture that we live in, we might not even see it. Often starts at birth and ends after we no longer live in this world. And that constant drip, 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 drip has been labeled, as Maria Root, as insidious trauma. And patriarchy is a really good example of that. The fact that, okay, for example, when I leave the house at night, I need to be thinking, okay, are there going to be lights? Where are my car keys? Can I get hold of pepper spray? Oh, it's not even legal here. Whatever, something to protect myself. So, but when my husband goes out, does he think of any of that? No. So this is one of those drips, drips, drips that just continues throughout your life. And domestic abuse is another example of that. An event of, say, if you are battered, could be a single instance of trauma, but the constant being under the threats and the humiliation and everything else that an abuser does can also have this drip, drip, insidious effect. So what is it that then we can learn about this when it comes to the Bible? And here I have diverted slightly. I have gone and want to look at a story, not in Isaiah this time around, but in Genesis. And in Genesis, we have a story of this woman called Hagar. And when it comes to Hagar, she is an Egyptian slave girl owned by Sarah, Abraham's wife. And when it comes to Genesis 16, they have been in Canaan for 10 years now. Abraham has been promised a son who would actually come out from his own body, but no such child is yet to be seen. So then Sarah gets an idea and basically says, oh, I've got a slave woman. So Abraham, you go and sleep with her. And so then I can have children through her. And this is something that scholars have said that based on some ancient Near Eastern laws might have actually been a practice, that if a woman couldn't give birth to children, that she could give her slave woman to kind of build her family through her. And of course, now here we have patriarchal culture screaming down the phone, because what we have here is, first of all, a culture that for reasons of survival and others is obsessed by having children. And that is what Sarah is mainly there for. And she is so concerned about it that for her, it is completely fine to give her slave girl, basically a woman who has no say in this matter whatsoever, to sleep with her husband, and her husband is okay with that as well. Now, in an ancient culture, that might have been okay, but us as readers, we might be looking at that and saying, what? What on earth is going on in this passage? Why aren't people doing different things, making different decisions? And as it then turns out, Hagar then, as a friend of mine who researches this passage, she would call it rape. After she has experienced this, she then becomes pregnant. And the thing is that in the Bible, it then says that basically Hagar despised her mistress. Now, in the Hebrew, that phrase is slightly more ambiguous. It's more like her esteem was lowered in Hagar's sight. So it could simply be that Hagar is getting a sense of self-worth, and that she is no longer seeing herself as just a slave to Sarah. It could mean that Sarah might have just imagined it. We can understand that in a situation where we've got two women and one man, the one without the child might just get this impression that whether the person is doing anything or not, that it is somehow oppressive. Whatever is happening here, Sarah isn't very happy about it, and so goes to Abraham and says to him that, oh, you are responsible for this entire mess. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but that is what she says. And basically, Sarah wants him to sort the situation out. And what Abraham ends up then doing is that, well, your slave is in your hands, do with her as you wish. And this is really bad because, yes, again, based on ancient Near Eastern laws, a slave wife's position could be lowered by her mistress if she was misbehaving. But what the fact that we have this tension is already showing to us that Abraham is not taking Hagar's side. He is not considering her at all. He is not considering the two women living in his household or trying to take care of the situation. So we have now three people living under this patriarchal system that wants children at any cost, regardless of consequences, almost regardless of consequences, I would have to say. And so we've got Abraham, who potentially rapes a woman here. We have Abraham, who is not taking care of his household. We've got Sarah, whose idea it was in the first place, and Hagar, who may or may not have been despising her mistress. And so here we have both men and women being oppressors. And that's an important thing to know, that when we are looking at issues to do with women and girls, patriarchy is a big part of what these women and girls have gone through. But what is also important is that it is not just men who can oppress. Sarah is perfectly capable of having her own way here. And so what Sarah ends up doing is that she then mistreats Hagar. And the word that is used for this mistreatment is ana, and this is used of a particular form of this word is used of Israelites' experience of slavery and oppression in the hands of the Egyptians. So this is actually severe, what is being done to Hagar, to the extent that she then actually flees. And this is important to notice here, is that when it comes to people in general, but women and girls in particular for this talk, is that people respond to trauma differently. So whether with Hagar, this was say a one instance of Sarah beating her up or something, I'm just making this up here, whatever the oppression was that overwhelmed her and her instinct is to flee, or whether it's this constant drip, 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 drip into her system and she decides to flee. When it comes to trauma, some people flee and they will go into hiding. Others turn into aggression. Others try to defend themselves or do something about it. And yet others freeze. So they are so overwhelmed that their body is kind of so frozen that, and it's based on this idea that, well, if I'm kind of just frozen, maybe the threat won't notice me, or they will just ignore me and stop doing what they're doing. So when it comes to instances of women being violated and people are like, oh, well, why didn't she scream? Or why didn't she hide? Or why did she do this and then and the other? Those are decisions that you don't necessarily always make for yourself. People respond to trauma differently. And I think this is something we need to understand when it comes to women and girls, is that there will be different responses and we need to respect these. And so what happens to Hagar is that she does enter this survival mode. Then people who have been living with oppression or with trauma, often their instinct is towards survival. Her survival instinct is telling her to run. What is happening here then is that she is basically centered on purely on her survival, her baby's survival, and what can happen as the consequence of that. So, excuse me, sometimes people treat women and girls, but people who have been traumatized, as some sort of, oh, they lack empathy. What about Sarah? What about Abraham? Why wasn't she thinking that? Well, you wouldn't, would you, you dolt? She was fighting for her own survival, and that very survival instinct would have kicked in, and in her case would have caused her to flee. Now, how is it that we can then deal with this as Christians? What is it that we can do when it comes to women and girls recovering from trauma? Now, what is interesting, and I do have to say that Genesis 16 is a bit of a difficult passage because Hagar does meet with God or with an angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord tells her to go back. So that is a particular aspect of this story that is really troubling, and to which I'm not going to go into. But what two aspects that I do want to approach from it is that there are two things that she gets from the angel. First of all, she gets this promise that you shall name him, the child that she is bearing, Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. And what is interesting is that Ishmael literally in Hebrew means either God hears or may El, God hear. And what is interesting about this name is that when this name is being given to Ishmael, it literally underlines the fact that God has heard. He has heard. And when it says here in this translation that for the Lord has heard of your misery, again, this word for misery, it comes from that same ana, from that same word. God has seen it, God has heard it. So there is something extremely intimate in the knowledge that God knows the suffering, God has seen the suffering, God has taken account of that. One of the big things where Hagar is unique in the Bible is that she actually gives God a name. Nobody else in the entire Bible ever gives God a name, ever. God gives himself a name, or you can name a place after God or an altar after God or something like that, but Hagar is the only one who actually names God. And this is what she says: you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. And again, this idea that God has seen her suffering, her suffering has been taken into account, and that's a name she gives to God. So there is something incredibly meaningful in these encounters with God, that even in the middle of her misery, even the fact that she has to go back to be continued at some other point, that story, she does have a profound meeting with God that changes her and somehow gives her that sense that God is with her, God has seen her suffering. And the thing is that part of the healing process is to have those experiences, with God. But it's not just God that we need here. We also need other people. So Proverbs 9 is a story of Lady Wisdom who goes out and calls for people to come to her house and gain wisdom and knowledge. And she's literally calling out to anyone who isn't as stubborn and doesn't want to hear her. And there is something beautiful about this idea of people coming to her house and having a meal. Because when it comes to recovering from trauma, whether we are talking about this kind of one event trauma or something that is continuous, we are looking at a couple of things that we can do as God believers. And Judith Herman, again, a trauma person here, has stated that there are 3 stages of trauma recovery. The first one is to establish safety. Because when it comes to people who are recovering, they don't feel safe with other people. They might not even feel safe within themselves. So this idea that they can come to a community where they can be safe, where they can be accepted, where people will actually show them that they are worthy. A lot of the time, the self-esteem of a person who's gone through trauma is somewhere in the dumps. And it's really important that we try to reestablish that and reestablish that sense of safety. The second one is mourning and remembrance. Now, when it comes to that, this is to do with the processing of trauma. It is to listen to those stories. It is to be able to hear those memories when people try to start to process them. Even if you have to listen to them 50 times, do, because this is part of going through the trauma. It's not about, oh, forgive everyone right now, but it is about going through it, mourning it, grieving it, and in one way or another, remember it. And the last one, which is my last point, Jasmine, I'm being very punctual here, is reconnection. It is the reconnection to yourself, to know that you have a future and you have a point and a purpose, and reconnecting with other people. And in all of this, we as people of God can be extremely helpful to women and girls whose experiences under patriarchy can be sometimes different to other people's experiences, and even to our individual experiences. My experience under patriarchy will be probably nothing like Jasmine's. We have experienced different things, but that if we follow this idea of reconnecting, finding safe places, and listening to those stories, we can do a whole world of good. There we go.
Thank you, Kirsi. That's really helpful in terms of reflecting on some of the concern and curse that we need to be aware of when we think about the whole theme of when all the world are invited to Mount Zion. So Isaiah is talking about rebuilding and rebuilding and reconstructing the community and the family.
Mm-hmm.
And when one family is missing, then we need to talk about all those concerns that you have raised when the women and girls they face when they face a trauma, and what are the things needs to be remembered in order to in order to rebuild the whole community. So I think when we talk about the whole world and the whole community being rebuilt. So we need to be aware of different people, those who are marginalized and excluded. So that's really helpful. And just wanted to say that if you have any questions for Kirsi, there is a question time later on this evening, and that will be picked up and the Kirsi will answer those questions. And if you've got any questions, could you please put it in the chat? Then we will collect those questions, and later on we will come back to that. Kirsi, so much for your contribution this evening, and looking forward to answering the questions if people ask any questions to you.
I shall intercede for divine wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. I hand over to Sharon to introduce the next video.
Hello, yes. So as Jasmine said earlier, we are hearing from diverse voices, diverse perspectives on the book of Isaiah and the particular theme that has already been mentioned. So I had a chat with somebody who's here live, but we decided to pre-record just to try and avoid some of the technical difficulties that can happen. And so Michael's going to play that, and you will hear the introduction, and you'll be able to speak to Karen later as well. So Michael, if you can play the interview, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yes, my name is Reverend Karen Bell. I'm a Methodist minister in the London district, specifically in the Romford circuit. I have a physical disability called scoliosis, and this is something I've lived with my entire life. And I have studied disability theology as part of my master's degree while I was training to be a minister. So I have some theological experience and some personal experience of disability.
So Karen, can I ask you to tell us, from your perspective, what does the gathering of the whole world to Mount Zion mean to you?
The gathering of the whole world to Mount Zion means to me that every single person on this planet is welcome at Mount Zion. We are all welcome in God's kingdom. And I was thinking about, as I was reading the texts, how, if we were thinking of physically getting to Mount Zion, if it was a physical mountain, how would some people get up that mountain, especially from a disability perspective? If people have got physical disabilities, they may not be able to get up the mountain. Who's going to help them? But from a spiritual perspective, of course, everyone is welcome on to the mountain.
Absolutely, thank you. So as someone who does have a physical disability, what do you find helpful or unhelpful in the text?
I didn't have too many comments on unhelpful things, but on the text that I was reading from Isaiah, I did note that there were a number of verses that talked about seeing with our own eyes and looking for God with our own eyes. And I did think that some people with visual impairments might find some of those texts difficult. I'm not saying that all people with visual impairments would struggle with that, but some people might. And it's important for us to remember to note that when we're reading scripture, if we're reading from a disabled perspective, we have to acknowledge that the Bible was written in an age where disabled people were entirely overlooked. Today, of course, in our culture and society, disabled people have more access than ever before. But back in those days, disabled people were very overlooked. And so we have to acknowledge that there are some very difficult and tricky texts within our scripture that are challenging to disabled people. And we shouldn't just gloss over them. We shouldn't try to rewrite scripture. We need to wrestle with those scriptures and work out what they mean for us. For me, a very helpful text was in Isaiah 49. I just need to refer to it, sorry.
Yes, that's okay.
From my perspective, as a person who has had a disability all of my life, I was born with a back condition. The scriptures that really leapt out to me were in Isaiah 49, and the first one was in verse 1, actually. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. And then again in verse 5, and now the Lord said, who formed me in the womb. And for me, those kinds of verses are so powerfully important. So Psalm 139 is another one that talks about being knitted together in our mother's womb. And it reminds me that as a disabled person, I am not a mistake. God can't make mistakes. And as somebody who was created in my mother's womb with a particular back condition, it reminds me that God loves diversity, and he thinks that I am wonderfully made, even though society might tell me that I'm the wrong shape. God tells me that I am perfectly made in his image, and that's a very powerful statement. And the second thing I wanted to say, again from Isaiah 49, was that although it doesn't talk about disability, it does talk about suffering in that chapter. And it talks about people who have been bereaved or are unable to have children. And in that, God says, I will not forget you. I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. And again, I think that's very powerful to remember that when we're going through any kind of suffering, and disabled people go through all sorts of different suffering, whether that's through pain or through society's, perspectives. It's important to remember that we are in God's hands.
Amen. Completely agree. Great news. Can I ask Karen about any language or practices within the church that are either invitational or exclusionary for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I've got quite a few and I could go on for a really long time about this, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. What I'm going to do is talk about the exclusionary practices and try to give some positive invitational advice in response to the exclusionary practices. So first of all, our buildings and our furniture can be very exclusionary to some people with disabilities. The law states that all of our buildings have to be accessible. And by and large, all of our buildings are accessible to people with disabilities. However, there are degrees of accessibility, and some churches that have pews in them, for instance, can cause some challenges. I've been in a number of churches where the people have tried to make accommodation for people with disabilities by removing some of the pews at the back, and that is a great step. That is really great. And I'm not saying that we should tear out all of our pews either, because, for instance, Wesley's Chapel is a beautiful building that is full of history and heritage, and it would be wrong to take our pews out of that building. However, to give the perspective of somebody who might be a wheelchair user, imagine coming in and being told where you have to sit, and your friends and family might not be able to sit with you. And if you choose to sit with your friends and family, you might either be in the aisle and be A, a fire hazard, and B, feel awkward, or you may have to sit at the front and you may feel as if people are staring at you. Disabled people get stared at every single day of their lives just by walking down the street. And so that can be extremely intimidating, especially if it's your first time in a church, to have to sit at the front. So what can we do about that? Well, if you are in a church where you don't have the problem of pews, then you have a little bit more flexibility to think about where people might like to sit. They might not want to be right at the front, but they might not want to be right at the back either. And even if you do have pews and you are in a position to remove a few, you might be able to give people options by removing a row in the middle and a row at the back. So people do have some options of where they could sit rather than just being told you have to sit here. And also give people plenty of space to choose that where they might like to sit as well, because if that is the first time they're coming into a church building, it can be a really scary thing. The second thing is language. We assume that everybody is at the same level of intellect that we are, and that everyone can understand language in the same way that we can. But some people with learning disabilities may be able to access the sermon, for instance, in the same way that we can. And for that reason, whenever I'm leading a service, I always put in a children's talk, even if there aren't going to be any children in the congregation, because there may be people in the congregation that have a learning disability. And children's talks are usually less theological, but still giving a message. And they're also often visual, which is very helpful to people with a learning disability as well. So even if somebody isn't able to access the sermon, they can still go away with a message, hopefully from the children's talk. So that's a way of getting around language. The second is noise. Oh, the third is noise. An organ can be extremely loud. A worship band can be extremely loud to someone with a sensory issue like autism. And of course, worship is wonderful, and we want to have worship with an organ, and we want to have worship with our worship band. What can we do to help people who actually feel pain from loud noises? Well, we might be able to offer a room near to the church sanctuary where people can go if they find it too loud, and maybe the music can be piped into that room, but the volume turned down lower, so that those people can still worship, but at a volume that is less intense for them. And then they can always come back into church for the sermon afterwards. And that's a way around that situation. And then reading. We assume that everyone can read, but some people struggle with dyslexia. Some people struggle with learning disabilities that has impeded their ability to read. But we have screens in our church buildings, and we give out hymn books. And some people, of course, have visual impairments as well that impede their ability to read. What can we do to help people who might struggle to read our screens or read our hymn books and our worship books? Well, for people with visual impairments, we could give large print books or printed out sheets. But my advice would be to ask somebody, especially if you know someone has dyslexia or a visual impairment, ask them, what would help us? What would help you in this situation for us to give you to help you to read? That person is going to feel so welcome in the building by you asking them for their advice, rather than you just assuming that a large print book is going to help. So always ask someone with a disability what they need in that situation. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was very comprehensive and very sound advice there for anyone who has tuned in. Is there anything else that you feel that you have to bring that you don't always have the platform to share?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this question. And I think for disabled people in our church communities, we sometimes don't have a voice or we do have a voice, but it's not always heard. And there are so many campaigns and there are so many things that we're fighting for in the church that disabled people's voices often become unheard. And if you think about it from a disabled perspective, people with disabilities are constantly fighting for their rights. They're battling with medical appointments and doctors and nurses and their rights for treatment. And then there's the treatment itself, which sometimes can be difficult. And then disabled people are also battling with their own bodies and pain in their own bodies quite often, as well as getting on with their everyday lives, like everybody else, and the stress and strains of just normal life. So when it comes to fighting for rights within church, disabled people are just tired. And it would be wonderful if some people who are able-bodied could come alongside us and help us to shout from the margins and to hear what we have to say, because we have a lot to say, because we read the Bible from a disabled perspective. And we have testimony of how God has healed us in unusual ways and has walked with us through our journeys of disability. But we do need our able-bodied brothers and sisters to come alongside us, to help us to fight.
Thank you very, very much, Karen. As I said there and say again, that was really comprehensive. We are going to hear from Karen. I've seen questions and comments going in the chat, so anybody who wants to talk to Karen. Karen, do you want to just say hi now so people know you're about?
Hello, everyone.
Oh, it didn't spotlight you, never mind. Okay, so we're going to have a little 5-minute break, no more than 5 minutes. Stretch your legs, have a comfort break, and we'll be back. We'll be hearing from Raj. So 5 minutes, please, all, and we'll see you soon.
Now we have Reverend Dr. Raj Bharat Patta with us. Raj is an ordained minister from Andhra Evangelical Lutheran Church in India, but he is currently serving as a Methodist minister at United Stockport Circuit. He completed his PhD from the University of Manchester, and his thesis is on the topic of subaltern public theology for India. And he is very well into Dalit theology and the public theology. So he's the right person to reflect on the passage from economic migrants' perspective, as well as in the context of political unrest in this country. Hand over to you, Raj.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jasmine. It is such a delight to be here this evening, sharing, reading the book of Isaiah from a migrant's perspective. I mean, to begin, I can tell a story, lots of stories about my migrant experiences living in the UK, but with the situation of the flight not being taken to Rwanda last night, I thought it would be a good start for us to think what should be a Christian response. And if Isaiah is in the room today, I thought I would offer 3 Isaian responses in light of the Rwanda flight, which was not taken off last night due to the European Court of Human Rights decisions, but all the more, there is some hope for humanity to thrive. So therefore, the flight to Rwanda was not taken off. So in such a context, on one hand, we have the Rwandan flight asylum plan. On the other hand, we also, public sphere today is defined with the rising cost of living, where people are asking, we are unable to heat or eat. So what should be our theme? And again, I think Isaiah offers some consolation and hope in the context of either heat or eat. what should be the gospel from Isaiah. And we also know that migration today in the UK is one of the hot topics. Migration has been there from times immemorial. But however, migration today the word has become such a toxic word, and there is so much hatred on people who do not look like us, who do not believe like us, and who do not where we belong. So with all this, the public sphere buzzing with such public issues, I think there is a theological call for all of us, and Prophet Isaiah's prophecies come handy with source of consolation. So particularly with the Rwandan flight not taken off, if first Isaiah is in the room, and I hope there are 3 Isaiahs, and as the scholarship agrees and speaks all of it, and I think if first Isaiah has to respond and is on the Zoom room today, he would have said Isaiah chapter 9, verse 9, and he would say, "They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters covers the sea." So when there is a full knowledge of the Lord, there will be humanity thriving, and care for the others will be prominent. And I'm sure first Isaiah would offer this prophecy from chapter 9, verse 9. If second Isaiah has to be in the room, and he's in the room, because as we read the book of prophet Isaiah, his offering to the Rwandan flight not taking off would be 49th chapter, verses 9 and 10, where he says, "Come out to those who are in darkness, show yourselves, they shall feed along the ways, on all the bare heights shall be their pasture. They shall not hunger or thirst, neither scorching wind nor sun, and the mountains will be turned into a road," is how second Isaiah would offer, trying to say, don't take a flight off, but you bring down and make the mountain into a road where there will be a space for everyone. So I hope second Isaiah, if he's on the call, on the room, he would answer that way. And if third Isaiah is in the room, and I'm sure he's in the room, he would say from chapter 61, verses 1 and 2, which Jesus again read out as his Nazareth manifesto, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news and then healing, liberation, and to proclaim the year of the Lord," which again would say there should not be any more Rwandan plan, because it is totally inhuman and it is unchristian. And I think as Christians, book of Isaiah offers all hope and consolation to contest such moves as we see these days. But as I began reading the prophet Isaiah from a migrant's perspective, there is so much that I want to offer, but to be concise, I just want to say, why was Isaiah called a major prophet? Of course, there are biblical theologians in the room, and I'm sure they would give us so much. But for one reason, I think because of the length of the prophecy, it is called major prophet, whereas Amos and Jonah are called minor prophets. Not that their message is not important, but I think just for the length of the prophecy. But however, reading it from the context of migrants and political situation of unrest, I see such labelings needs to be contested and questioned. Why is the prophecy of Isaiah major, whereas so it should be prophecies all along? And Walter Brueggemann would say, book of Isaiah is not just a political history, not a political theory, nor a history, but it is a combination of politics and history and theology, which he says it is prophecy. And therefore, all these prophecies together is not about something about foretelling, but again, speaking on behalf of God, the justice of God in his times. The second thing I was thinking about Isaiah as a person, whether you call it three scholarship in terms of 3 Isaiahs, but reading from the biblical history, we know Isaiah was from the northern territory, active ministry in Jerusalem, which is the southern territory. And some scholars also say he has prophesied under 4 kings and has a royal descent. Maybe some say he was a cousin of King Uzziah. However, again, reading it from a migrant's perspective, I see that upside down, being a northerner, being a royal descent, he had centers of power access. However, prophecies of Isaiah were related to people who were powerless, who were destroyed, the land that was destroyed, desolation. So in that flip side, though being powerful, Isaiah chose to speak on behalf of God, God's truth and God's justice in the categories of powerlessness to offer hope and consolation to powerless situations. One thing that stood striking for me from the prophecies of Isaiah was he was naked for 3 years. In chapter 20, Isaiah was naked for 3 years. Just again, as I said, though born with a royal descent, a kingly ally, he chose to be on the side of the powerless, and therefore he continued. Not only that, I also see that Prophet Isaiah is not just standing on a shore and offering his preaching, but his involvement and participation in the journey, be it pre-exile, exile, or post-exile. He was involved and participating in that movement forward is what I see. The third thing I'll see about Isaiah is he was a city dweller. He was an urbanite. Maybe in today's term, he was a Londoner. But however, he wanted to be a rural suburban person like Stockportian, wanted to understand the countryside on the peaks, and therefore his imagery and the prophecies are full of countryside imageries, trees, vineyards, fields, vegetations as metaphor and life sustaining. And therefore he is trying to see an inclusive ecology. Though a Londoner, though an urbanite, his intention in his prophecy was an inclusive prophecy of plant imagery, trying to see that he want to identify with the people on the countryside. So maybe if you see those particular words in chapter 35 of 9 and 10, redemption and ransom, he's not just saying that to be some market terms, but he's trying to say how important this message is that we need to translate in terms of an inclusive imagery where the ecology and the creation continues to celebrate God's glory in our lives. The fourth thing I want to offer is the language of the outsider. Again, living as a migrant in this context, I understand many times I want to offer something, but though that belongingness always matters. Where do I belong? Do I belong in this context or in my home context? But however, that there is an ambiguity in my location. So if you see the journey of the three Isaiahs, the way they try to offer a gospel of belonging, I would come again in a minute about home, but the one that stood out for me is the way outsider Cyrus was referred as a shepherd, as Christ or Messiah, or the righteous who rebuilds. So if he can locate a Messiah in an outsider in the Persian situation, how much has he cared for his own community? So he has seen the divine in a stranger. He has seen the voice of the divine among the subalterns throughout the 66 books. So I think that offers a hope for me as a migrant, again, living in this context. Fifthly, for me, it is a home away from home. The gospel of Isaiah is about a home away from home. Pre-exilic, as Chris was already speaking about the trauma, there was a pre-exile trauma for people because they were hearing the message of desolation, destruction, and living among the Assyrian powers. There was lots of trauma in 1 to 39 chapters. And then they go on to the exile, the trauma continues, intensifies. And then there is a hope that comes out. So in a way, we see a theology of home away from home. They were at home, but that longing to return to home, trying to make a home in a new place, trying to offer worship in a new place, familiar landscape, center of worship, sense of belonging, a profound longing, all the more the longing for God, the longing to wait on Yahweh is something very profound in the gospel of Isaiah. So I think that a home away from home, if you read chapter 40, comfort and things like that, they're offering this theology of a home away from home in the writings of the prophecy of Isaiah. The seventh one, for me, is in the writings of the book of Isaiah, I see a migrant God for a migrant people. God journeys. And that God becoming a migrant for me is something really helpful. And as I said, if you see the first 12 chapters of the book of Isaiah, you see how a foreigner invades. But in all of this, the story is not about Jerusalem or about Judah or Israel, but in all of this, the way God journeys with this people. So though he offers he speaks difficult words to the powers, but he's trying to say God is journeying with us. The Redeemer is journeying with us. And that is a hope which I see, because Isaiah offers a migrant God for a migrant people. Then eighthly, in terms of the light of God, which is the theme, we see about the light, for me, chapter 49 of Isaiah, where the prophecy is about Israel will be the light to the nations. My salvation may reach, to the end of the earth. 49, chapter 49, verse 6. Light to the nations, and my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Personally, as a student of public theology, the binaries of light and darkness are a bit contested for me. In a sense, there's a book by my colleague, Superintendent Kathy Bird, where she writes the divine heart of the darkness and the divine heart of God in the darkness. So trying to say, how do you understand light against darkness? But I understand maybe for Isaiah's worldview, people understood it. But when we use light today, I think we need to use it with a little more sensitivity. But in Isaiah chapter 49, there is that chosenness. We are a chosen nation. And it continues. But I think if at all we are reading Isaiah for our times today from a migrant perspective, I see that chosenness needs to be a site where we need to give up our privilege. And Anthony Reddy, in Theologizing Brexit, explains how white exceptionalism, or in the US, the American exceptionalism, or the local exceptionalism, we are the locals, this land belongs to us, has always been there. But in Isaiah chapter 49, when the prophet was prophesying that you will be a light to the nations, he also says you will be a light to the nations, provided you serve those who are suffering, and you also need to identify and locate yourself with the people who are journeying in the journey of suffering. So I think that promise needs to be continued, and we need to say, I think privilege needs to be addressed as a theological category in our moving forward. He also uses the word, the sword and a quiver. Things like that. The plowshares will become flattened, and there is so much of war imagery. But in all of this, the call is, can we identify privilege, and how do we confess as we read the book of Isaiah? The next one for me is, book of Isaiah offers for me as a migrant is to speak truth to the powers. Again, that gospel of contestation, contesting and speaking truth to the powers. And if you have the servant songs in 50, for example, chapter 50, verses 4 and 5, where he said the suffering servant will be a teacher who contests, so a teacher who just not always praises you and clap hands, but a teacher who pisses you off by speaking truth to the power. So in the other, can we see something to learn from the other and try to contest? So that would be a key thingy for us to take forward when we read the three Isaiahs. Then the next one for me is the whole theme of book of Isaiah is about interruption, that divine interrupting the so-called oppressive status quo. So if you read chapter 64, you see that pause where the divine intervenes to see that the whole ecology and creation again join in praising God. So there are those interruptions that need to be made. And in all of these 66 books, if you see, there is a constant divine interruption into the life systems and trying to offer hope, though it is some strong message at some point, but it ends on the message of hope that we see throughout. The penultimate one I want to share is also about silence on the suffering servant. The suffering servant has been silent. And I think we have several times used this imagery of silence. For me, what offers hope is that when Philip in Acts chapter 8 was reading the book of Philip, he was reading in Acts chapter 8 verses 32 and 33. He was reflecting on Isaiah 53, where 7 and 8, quoting and asking, how do I understand to Philip? And Philip quotes 53, where Isaiah chapter 7 and 8, asking him, who is the prophet saying about? Is it? And then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. I think we have most times said this suffering servant is Jesus Christ. But however, what I gathered in from Acts chapter 8, verse 35 is, then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. So that the Isaiah text, a text in its colonized setting, and the suffering servant of the exilic times, was a starting point to build up and to speak about the good news of Jesus. So suffering servant, the silence became a starting point to share the gospel of Jesus Christ for the person who was traveling in Acts chapter 8. And also the suffering servant, you see that the sheep is silent before its shearers. And I mean, if you reflect on the sheep and the shearer, who is all set to cut the fleece, is the sheep willingly going to the shearer to rip off its fleece? Or does the shearer catch the sheep by force and power and cuts the fleece? The shearer overpowers the sheep, puts the weight of his body on the sheep, turns and overturns the sheep in all directions according to his convenience and of his cutting machine, and shears all the fleece. So the sheep wiggles and even bleats. However, from the perspective of the shearer, the sheep is always silent, or to say it in other words, the shearer does not listen to the bleat of the sheep, and therefore, out of that colonial knowledge of the shearer, it said, the sheep is silent before the shearer. The sheep might be communicating her displeasure, yet because it is the knowledge of the powerful shearer that thrives, the voice of the sheep remains silent. To put it other way, though the sheep tries to bleat and speak, the powerful shearer doesn't give a damn to the voice of the sheep. And therefore, all he listens is the silence of the sheep. So can the sheep speak? Yes, of course, but not the language that the shearer is willing to listen or understand. So what I am trying to say in all of this is, Isaiah is offering a contested knowledge, a knowledge from below, allowing that it is those that below have a knowledge, a different knowledge system, but it offers redemption and salvation to all of us. So my final thing I want to say is to conclude with Isaiah chapter 11, the peaceful kingdom, where in that peaceful kingdom, everyone will gather on that mountain. But how do they gather? And if you see, there is peace between, in the Hebrew text, I understood all the strong animals have a masculine gender and the weak animals were given a feminine gender. Very unfortunate. And in that peaceful, the lion and the lamb will live together, where everyone will come together. Not only that, the lion, though he is a non-vegetarian, but chooses to eat a vegetarian. The lion will eat straw like the grass. It is not the cow and the lamb eating the non-vegetarian meat, but it is that giving up that privilege and eating the food of the people on the margins, and a child going to lead all of this. And so there are so many signs where people who we think will not be leading will be leading, and they will all thrive towards us, and they will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. So the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters covers the sea. When there is knowledge of the word of the Lord, I think we will all be gathered over there. And so as listeners in this 21st century, what is it for us? And I think for us, the call is to ask God that we can listen to alternate voices where the divine is continuing to speak to us today. And Isaiah offers that. And not only it is about destruction, but it is a message of hope. And today, in the context of the Rwanda plan, I think as Christians, as followers, as readers of the book of Isaiah, we are called to say, I want to stand with Isaiah and say, we need to stop this flood. And I think we need to call it inhuman and unchristian only then, and see to it. There are so many ways of advocacy that we can do, right? Your local MP, the City of Sanctuary is offering us resources. The Joint Public Issues team is offering us resources. The Methodist Church JDS strategy has so much that offers to us. So in all of this, I think as Christians, we need to live out our gospel relevant for the public sphere. And only then we will be faithful followers. Otherwise, another year, we just read or not. It is not about how many times you read your word, but how best we understand and apply and transform the word. If the word can make that sense, I'm sure it is helpful for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you very much for your reflection. It's really important to say that how do we connect a biblical text to today's context? And it was, good to you started with if Isaiah was here, and how will he respond to current crisis? So that's, I think, very much important to think about for any biblical text and how we connect with day-to-day life situation. But also you covered quite a lot of points, and there's so many challenges that you made us to kind of think. So the language of the outsiders and God, one who is journeying with everyone, that is a hope. And listening to the alternative voices, and that's always important for alternative readings. So if at all, if we get a full picture of God's kingdom, that we need to hear from the voices which has been marginalized throughout this, the history that we come across, and giving up our privileges in order to encourage the marginalized to come up. I think one of the passages in the Isaiah talks about the hills made low and the valleys lifted up. So it's, that is a kind of two ways system where the hills needs to be made low so that those who are in the valley can be lifted up. So I think quite a lot of points that reflection that you have given, which will be helpful for all of us. I think this is thank you very much, Raj, once again. And this is a time for questions. And if any of you got any questions to either to Raj or Kirsi and Karen, and this is the time to ask.
I actually wrote a question in the chat for Karen. Yay, there she is. Hello. And I know, I guess I need to remember what it was. Here we go. I wrote a question here. Yes. Do you believe all disabilities will be healed in heaven, or are they part of our identity? So they might remain or perhaps be transformed. I found your presentation really intriguing because unlike what other people often assume, because my disability is invisible, I also live with a chronic illness. So this is a question I sometimes really ponder about: is disability even the right word to use? What do you think?
That's a very good question that you've posed, and there's no easy answer, unfortunately. Theologians go backwards and forwards on whether disability will be present in heaven. What we do know from scripture is that we are promised a new body when we get to heaven, and that we're promised that there'll be no more pain and no more tears when we get to heaven. So that's good news. So that suggests to me that our bodies are restored to some form of lack of pain. As someone who has a visible disability, this, whilst it causes me pain, it is a part of my identity. It's part of what makes me me. So I although I believe in a God who could physically heal me in an instant, I don't believe he will, because it is part of what makes me me. And it was God's purpose to create me in this way, since it's been a lifelong condition.
Yeah.
So for in my experience, I believe that in heaven I probably will look the same, but I will be fully restored at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a bit of both. That's my belief. But I can't base that in any scripture apart from the scriptures that I've quoted to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful, because my particular illness turned up in adult life, and I'm quite happy for people to pray healing all over me. But sometimes I'm just like, I wonder. I just wonder. So anyway, thank you. That was a really helpful answer. Thank you.
It's
Any more questions?
Can I ask something from Karen? Sorry, I just realised my camera's off. Sorry. Karen, you spoke about disabled people wanting able-bodied people to come alongside in the struggle, in the fight. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what that means in real terms, what would be welcomed from able-bodied people joining in that struggle.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind off the top of my head. The first would be to say that we need people that would be willing to be loud voices, because not all disabled people have a loud voice. And as I said in the recorded interview, that quite often disabled people are dealing with so many issues as well as normal life. It's just exhausting, and trying to fight for rights in the church as well is just one too many things. And it's easier to just go along with the flow than to stand up and be the one voice maybe in your church and then get shouted down. So we need people that are going to come around us and say, look, there's a person over here who is struggling and who needs help with X, Y, or Z. And in order for that to happen, we need people to listen to disabled voices who are shouting from the margins for rights in the community, for rights in society, for global rights, and also for rights in the Christian church today. So we need people to listen to us and to our stories of what it has been like being a Christian in the church. But we also need people to come alongside us and support us in the way forward.
Thank you, Karen.
Any more questions?
See, I'm filled with questions. So I'm quite happy to ask if no one else is going to ask anything. Yay! Oh, if you hear meowing, it's my cat. I haven't all of a sudden started speaking in tongues. Raj, thank you for that really excellent presentation. I find myself kind of torn a little bit here because I live with an invisible chronic illness, and I also come from another country, so I can kind of, in different ways, understand both of your talks. And one of the things that Raj, when I came to the UK, I really struggled. I came from Finland, so I look fairly similar, but I found people to be really condescending when it came to my the use of English language, or if I make a mistake, and I felt like people were treating me like I'm 5 years old. And I was anyway. I would like to just ask you, in your experience, that in our churches, what kind of simple things could we do to make people from other countries to be feel more welcome?
I mean, it is an important question, Kirsi, which you have said. One, our churches unfortunately don't reflect the public sphere where we live. So the 21st century British public sphere is multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilingual. But our churches unfortunately don't reflect that. So if at all we want our churches to move forward and want our churches to be missional, we need to consciously make such inclusions. And I want to qualify inclusion by, say, an inclusive diversity. So there are few people, as I see, who attend our churches, but they are narrowed, to only few kinds of jobs. Maybe for me, from my experience, what I have seen is there is so much generosity among our church members, which is good. There is warmth, the way they receive us, the way they welcome us, which is fine. But in the same way, we need to make consciously to see to it, our churches should be diversely inclusive and inclusive diverse. So if such a thing has to happen, we need to we need to really make an effort. For one example, as an Indian fellowship within Manchester, we rent a church building to have a service. And the relationship has always been only an owner and a tenant with the British Christian Church and a local Indian fellowship. So like that, I can tell within Manchester, there are about 100 fellowships of different languages meeting across. And the relationship is only a tenant and an owner, because as churches, we own buildings. So I think personally, I feel we need to get away with that mindset and say, we want to consciously integrate. So what I am offering in my church, where a group offers is, can we do a joint service, for example? It might be too much for both the churches because the kind of theology and the way they do the worships are different. However, if we have to make a change, can we do that? A conscious joint service between the church who rents our church and the members with our congregation is one way, is how I see. And secondly, within the bus you board, there will be so many people who you talk on the way. So how do we make friendships with people who do not look like us? So there is already a prejudice, a tag of prejudice. And in that prejudice, it is difficult. I know, again, coming from India, my English is not my first language. But people keep telling, I do understand what you say, but it is Indian English, it is not English English. I was struggling initially, what is this English English? But eventually I understand, because when I think in my language and I communicate, I still, my worldviews are in two worldviews, and I translate them, I offer them in my own way. So yeah, so there are multiple threads, but at least start a conscious inclusion and getting away with a tenant and owner relationship.
Well, that would be an excellent starting point. Thank you.
Do you mind if I chime in with a question for all three of you? Just as I've been thinking about questions about, how do we create space for people? How do we make sure that we can be aware of some of our unconscious practices, use of language, use of space and buildings, othering of people, all of that sort of thing. I've been wondering about what's the place of some of the sacraments and the practices that we've been given to try and, in terms of standing in the gap where we're kind of culturally we get things wrong. I'm always intrigued by how simplistic and beautiful something like the Eucharist is as a means of, whether there's whatever the kind of barriers that might exist in the physical space or in the relational space, something about inviting everybody to partake of the same meal, however formalized that is, I think goes a long way to communicating and imparting the kind of church we're trying to be. And I'd just be interested if any of you have any particular reflections on the place of some of these key sacramental practices and how they can help instruct the church almost in this theology of inclusion, and that, and live out that image of everyone being welcome to flock to Zion.
I can go first with a comment on communion. We say that everyone is welcome at the communion table, but I know of a minister who it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, who could no longer stand to give communion because of a disability that minister had. And they were told that they could not sit down to give communion, that they had to stand. And that was the minister that was told that. And so that excluded the minister from giving communion, which was a calling on that person's life, and also receiving communion, because they could not physically get up to walk to the communion rail. If we are saying that everyone is welcome at the communion table, then that means that everyone is welcome at the communion table, whether you have to sit or whether you can stand, whether you kneel, whether you have to lie prostrate, whatever race, creed, color you are, we all come as human beings to the table of God because of Jesus' sacrifice. That's my interpretation of that sacrament.
I mean, my take, Michael, I totally agree with Karen. It is very unfortunate, and I think we need to confess for being an exclusive tables, because the table should be an open table. And one of my theses have been, before we come to Holy Communion, we need to have a social communion in terms of various colors. And without social communion, Holy Communion is just another ritual that we do. So Jesus says, first you go and reconcile with your brother or sister and then come. So we haven't emphasized on that reconciliatory building social communion as part of receiving Holy Communion. And the second thought about the Eucharist for me is we have over sanctified the Jesus' supper with his friends. Jesus was a jolly good guy. He likes parties, he eats with them. And it was a kind of way that Jesus celebrated his friendship and fellowship. And the last day before he was taken up to the cross, it was a mixed emotion. And over a meal, he was trying to engage and converse with them. So maybe perhaps it's time that we bring down the sanity of it by making holiness is about that messiness, eating and with the crumbs and with children, all of us together, and then celebrate, because it's time that we say, let's dine with Jesus as the Holy Communion.
Right. I think what I would add to this, and not that there is much left to add, those were two really, really good answers. From kind of gender perspective, I think first of all, you would have to have, like Karen was saying, regardless of your race, gender, ability, whatever, to be able to give it, so that it is not a case that it's always a guy giving, communing, or it's not always a white female doing it, or whatever, so that there is diversity already put in place in that. And Raj, what you were saying about this whole, that there has to be some sort of like more social harmony before you can actually have communion. What I find interesting in the 1 Corinthians passage where Paul talks about communion, well, I've forgotten the word, Eucharist, that there is this idea of examining yourself. And sometimes I kind of wonder if we let ourselves off the hook way too easily, would that be a time to actually to examine some of these attitudes and make a bit more of a thing about it. That sometimes we do have attitudes we might not be even aware of, that maybe we actually need to go a bit deeper into the biblical text and what it's actually asking us to do, rather than let's just all say sorry really quickly so that we can move to the main event. And I think that could be helpful.
Thank you all. They're really good answers and really helpful. Really appreciate it.
Can I just quickly say something? I was trying to unmute before Michael and it didn't happen. But anyway, I just quickly wanted to say in response to Kirsi, your question, going back to the book of Isaiah and this statement in it, in Isaiah 56, and God clearly says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And for me, that is the bottom line. So when we're talking about inclusion, and it amazes me that the church could in any way want to exclude people when God has stated explicitly that all are welcome, everyone should be included. All nations should be part of this. I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. If no more questions, then I'll hand out to Sharon to end this.
Thank you. We do have a couple of comments, and thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and we do have Bevan Powell with us, who is from the JDS team, and he is going to speak about the JDS strategy. And so with all that we've been talking about this evening, about everyone being welcome, what is the Methodist Church doing? And that is a key question. So how is what we're talking about for this Bible month, how does it fit with the Methodist Church when we talk about inclusion, all being welcome on the mountain? Over to you, Bevan.
Thank you, Sharon, and good evening to everyone. I feel really privileged that, being able to listen to the last sort of 15 minutes of the conversation that you've been having, in general terms around inclusion and the challenges for the church to ensure that, all Methodists are welcome, are heard, are able to participate. And for me, I think the justice, dignity, and solidarity strategy is a watershed moment, and it helps us to start to achieve some of the things that you've just been discussing. So, for instance, when Karen was talking about, able-bodied people coming alongside people with a disability, then if you listen to the title of the strategy, Justice, Dignity, and Solidarity, standing in solidarity next to people that may have a disability or are different to us in some way, being able to see God in the other, as well as seeing God in yourself. And Raj, spoke about this conscious inclusion. And again, it's been very intentional. The church has been very intentional in this inclusion journey. And then, Michael spoke about the theology of inclusion. And again, I think the justice, dignity, and solidarity strategy starts to bring that to life. So what I'm going to do over the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes is just to give you a very quick run through. For those of you that haven't heard of it, I'm sure most of you have heard of the strategy, but also just to highlight some of the key initiatives that's coming out of it, and also to point you to the website, the Methodist, the Inclusive Methodist Church website, that's got lots of resources that can really help circuits and local churches to start to embed a lot of the things that you've been talking about tonight. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is, Sharon, am I able to share, can I share screen?
Yes, absolutely, you've been co-hosted. Okay,
let me just do that then. Where are we? Okay, can you all see that? Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, the strategy for justice, dignity, and solidarity was adopted at the Methodist conference last year. And for me, it's a watershed moment. And the reason that it's a watershed moment are a lot of the things that you've just been talking about. It's about starting to embed some of the things that as a church we haven't got right. It's starting to look at the attitudinal challenges, how we as individuals see the other, how we see God in the other. We start to look at the cultural changes that so many of you were talking about. So not to depend on, an individual to, stand up for inclusion or, ensure that somebody else is included, but we change the culture of the church, that we are proactive in that. We start to think about the needs of others. And then there is systemic change. So, you were talking about Eucharist, you're talking about just our theology or range of theologies. It's looking at all of that and trying to ensure that where we are excluding, that we start to address those issues. Okay, let's get rid of this. Okay, so the aims of the strategy. And as I said earlier, the conversation that you were having, really, it was as if you'd written the strategy yourselves. It's really at the core of the strategy is recognizing the diversity of Methodist people and celebrating that diversity, because very often, when we look at who's celebrated or what is celebrated, it can sometimes be very monocultural. It can be very biased, and it's starting to the strategy demands that we start to celebrate all Methodists, that we start to celebrate the gifts and talents that all Methodists are given. The strategy sets out to eradicate all discrimination, and I should say, and abuse as well. That's a journey, but there is no place in the Methodist Church for discrimination. We're putting in place a number of major initiatives that will help us to achieve this. And the strategy demands that we start to treat everybody in a just way and with dignity. And then the third bullet point, if you bear with me 1 sec, I just need to change the gallery view that I have on my screen here. Hang on. Can I do that? Yes, brilliant. Okay, and the third point, the cultural change that I spoke about earlier on, that all Methodists are able to fully participate in the life of the church, in all aspects of the church. So when, when Michael spoke about this theology of inclusion, for me, that captures this, this very point around cultural change, to ensure that all Methodists are able to fully participate. Oh, okay. Let's just do the next one. Sorry. Okay. One of the major resources that we have is a user guide that you'll all be able to download from the website, and you'll be able to use it to assist in some of the discussions you've been having, in local churches and in circuits. And the user guide sets the intention of the JDS strategy, and it starts with who we are as Christians, as Methodists, and at the core of it is a focus on theology. It's celebrating God, who made each person in God's own image. It's being disciples of Jesus, and again, it talks about treating each person with dignity and rejoicing in the gifts of the Holy Spirit given to all people. And we believe that the strategy underpins our relationship with God, and that the transformation that we're looking for will be done through a number of the initiatives that we're putting in place, that we will start to see greater representation. Listening to your conversations, you spoke about greater listening, greater participation, celebrating diversity, equality, and justice and learning. Doing all of that, we believe that we will be transformed by God through openness to each other. And I'll make these slides available to you via Sharon. And obviously any questions that you might have, or any other resources that you might feel that you need, we can make available. So one of the things that conference asked last year, and is still current, is to ensure that equality, diversity, and inclusion is included on every church agenda. Every church agenda, every circuit agenda, every district agenda. And in terms of our connectional work, it should be included on the agenda of all of our it should be included in terms of all of our connectional committees. And one of the things that we are asking for is to have EDI officers on every district, and where possible, every circuit. And at the end here, it asks the question, you might not necessarily know at the beginning when you add this to your agenda, but then you can start to begin and reflect on the conversations that you've had this evening to start to inform what that agenda might look like. As I said earlier, we have a whole range of resources that I think you'll find really useful for local churches and circuits to really start to embed the work and to start to chip away at some of the challenges that you were speaking about earlier. The user guide. The user guide is a summary of the strategy, but it has a number of prayers, Bible readings, and it contextualizes the strategy in terms of our theology, in terms of transformation and our relationship with God. There's a personal responsibility commitment. And this is based on the fact that we are all learning, and learning is lifelong. And so there is a resource which is called a personal responsibility commitment, which helps in this continuous learning. And again, that can be downloaded from the website. We've also developed an equality impact assessment. Now, for those of you that perhaps work in the public sector or large private organizations, you probably would have come across impact assessments. But our impact assessment is slightly different. It has some of the same tenets and basic tools within it to help to identify disparities and disadvantage. But the starting point within our equality impact assessment tool is our theology and what the Bible says we should be doing. We spoke about language, or I heard you talking about language earlier on. And we have an inclusive language guide. And I'll just read the quote here that is taken from the guide. In the spirit of Christ, good, open, encouraging conversations based on careful listening are central to all positive relationships, including those within the church. Using careful and positive language is a key to effective ministry and mission. And so again, I would really encourage you to have a look at the inclusive language guide because I think you'll find it a really useful tool. And as I said earlier, under the JDS strategy, we are looking to have EDI officers on every district, and I'm pleased to say that we've more or less achieved that. I think there are a couple of districts that haven't got EDI officers, but we hope that that will change within the next few months. But it's also useful to have EDI officers at the circuit level. So, a lot of the challenges that you spoke about earlier on, I think can be addressed by local officers. And, Jill Marsh, who unfortunately can't be here with you tonight, she was originally, Reverend Jill Marsh was originally going to give this presentation. Jill and I really do encourage circuits to, look for volunteers or look for groups of people to come together to support this agenda. So that was a quick whiz through the strategy, because I know it's been a long evening for you. Let me just stop sharing. I hope that's given you a taste of the strategy and that you'll visit the website. And Sharon, I can send the slides to you, and for those that want the slides, we can make them available via Sharon. But really, please try and visit, have a look at the website. There really are some fantastic stories. That there are podcasts. There are all the tools that I spoke to you about earlier. And there are a number that are in development at the moment, which I won't go through now because, you know, as I said, I know you've had a long evening already, and this really was just a quick introduction to the strategy and how it might support and how it will support a lot of the things that you've been discussing tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Bevan. Thank you. Great. And yes, do please pop me the slides and I will pass them on to Michael, who will distribute them accordingly. Thank you very much. And as Bevan has said, there is certainly a lot on the website, so please do visit that. And I can attest that the work is underway to really make the Methodist Church an inclusive church in every sense of the word. Okay, over to Jasmine. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you. Just to conclude this evening, I don't want to make another presentation, just to make a few points. At least 3 points I would like to make. And the purpose of today's sessions is to get to some different perspectives when we read the book of Isaiah. But that's the model, but that could be the case for reading the whole Bible. And what I can see is 3 points here. One is unlearning some of the things we're supposed to have learned in order to marginalize or make kind of barriers between peoples. I think that is a good lesson from the first part of Isaiah. When we all talk about Zion, whether when the question was asked to Karen about whether the Zion, if it is a physical presence, definitely not everyone can climb on it. But if it is spiritual thing, that's fine. So what first Isaiah is trying to make here is that traditionally Jewish community understood Zion as a physical place where God's presence, Yahweh's presence was. And so in order to unlearn all those things, Isaiah is making some, it's more about the spiritual sense. More about kind of, he is not talking about the physical presence of the temple and the presence of God in that building. So the whole first Isaiah is against, all those kind of things which discriminated or alienated people from entering into the holy place. So that needs to be, and we can pick up that aspect of unlearning so many things in order to be inclusive community. There's so much that you can apply to day-to-day life in today's churches in context. And the second thing is delimiting the presence of God. And often we limit God's presence in one particular place based on our own experiences, based on our Christian group of people understanding. But this is, just slightly different from what Isaiah is emphasizing. If the second Isaiah is something message to the people, those who are in exile, then it's all about God's presence everywhere and trying to be inclusive and trying to see God in unknown places. What Raj was trying to say about how can we recognize divine in a stranger. So it's something, expanding our understanding of God beyond our familiar places. And thirdly, bringing borderless society. So when Isaiah chapter 19, when it talks about making highways between Assyria and Egypt, so they were the big power during that time, during the time of first Isaiah. But trying to say that the highways between Assyria and the Egypt, that means there is no border. People can travel to anywhere and everywhere. And the third Isaiah is something that talks about more of a universalistic nature of community, being a community together and accepting Cyrus as a Messiah. Cyrus, who was a Persian king who liberated them. So God anointed him and accepted him as a Messiah. So it's more about how can we be in a borderless society and not to discriminate based on any kind of, any barriers that a human being can think of, but just creating a borderless society where everyone will be included. So when we think about the whole point about when the whole world is invited to be at Mount Zion, and this is what I feel the Isaiah is talking about. Unlearning things that discriminate and alienate people, and recognizing God in every places, even in the unknown places, and making a borderless society so that we can be inclusive enough to include everyone, each and everyone. There is no single person can be excluded from God's kingdom. So that means the inclusive means inclusive, all means all. There is no one should be excluded. So borderless. So that kind of message, if you read Isaiah, so from the first part, the second part, and third part, it envisages some kind of inclusive community that are hoping for. I think more than that, the final point is Isaiah as a prophet, making the contestation against the political power. We as a church should be taking the prophetic role to condemn all the discrimination, all the exclusion that people are practicing. So we should be a prophetic community. So the role model from Isaiah is to be a prophetic community to contest any form of exclusion in our church community as well as in the day-to-day life. Thank you, everyone. And thank you especially for Kirsi, Karen, and Raj for your contribution, and I hope and people, those who are here and made use of your input this evening. And thank you, Bevan, very much appreciated. It's not only just what we are learning in the biblical text, but also how as a church can be an inclusive church. It's really important to hear what are the practical steps that you can take in your church, in your personal life, as well as in the church community and circuit. And thank you, everyone, those who participated this evening webinar. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Michael, to help us with the technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Michael, who has remained behind the scenes this evening, but certainly has helped this event to happen. And I would echo all that Jasmine said in terms of thanking all of you for being here with us. You've been most welcomed, and I really hope you are taking something away, something valuable, because lots has been deposited this evening. God bless you all. Thank you.